Welcome, everyone, to our latest Lunch and Learn session. What is Zionism? And the answer is that Zionism is the national liberation movement in modern times of the Jewish people. All right, now we can all go home. Nice learning with you. Nice having lunch with you. No, just kidding. We will, of course, be exploring this question in further depth together over the course of our time together, with more nuance and different sides of the issue. And what a great blessing it is to be able to do that, to see all of your faces here on the Zoom screen in this beautiful mosaic. If an ancient mosaic in the ancient Near Eastern mosaic style had been created of all the different Israelites at the border at the Jordan River, surely it would have looked a little bit like this. So perhaps Moses and our ancestors are indeed always with us when we study texts together. For those joining later on YouTube, I feel your presence here with us as well. Maybe, schedules may not have permitted joining in real time, but of course, all time is real time. Is there any other kind of time than real time? On some level, we're all together in mind and in heart, and what a great blessing indeed that is. I think what we will see together this morning or afternoon, it just hit 12, so there you go, can't say morning anymore, is that we are going to look at different visions within the overall philosophy and project of Zionism. We'll see political Zionism, cultural Zionism, the Zionism of action as distinct from words or theory. We'll see the role of diaspora Zionism, right? What's the role for us here not living in the land of Israel? We'll see religious Zionism. How is that different from cultural Zionism and secular Zionism? And then we'll see that Zionism itself has political splits within it. Originally, the split between labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism, which sets up for Israeli politics as we know it now. And I think when we see these different views, we'll see that Zionism is and always has been, like Judaism itself, what the rabbis of the Talmud called a dispute for the sake of heaven, a machloket leshem shemayim, which one might loosely translate as different views for the sake of all that is greater than ourselves, for the sake of coming closer to truth, to justice, to defending ourselves and others, and to what we're supposed to do in our moment with the ideals that we inherit, and what are the things that matters most and how to live them out together. This means, of course, that Zionism includes room for disagreement. After all, the founders of Zionism themselves disagreed with each other, so we are free as well to disagree with any one thinker or opinion, but it's part of the conversation, right? The machloket leshem shemayim, the dispute for the sake of heaven, defines us not by any one opinion, but by the conversation that we're part of, in which we listen and agree and disagree and learn from each other and grow together. The idea that Zionism has different views within it also means that should one object to any one opinion or stripe within Zionism, that does not paint all of Zionism with one brush and mean that all of Zionism is illegitimate. It's just not how movements and projects work unless they're extremely monolithic, right? You could disagree with a given action by the IRA in Ireland or Britain. You could disagree with a given position of the Sinn Féin political party. It doesn't mean the country of Ireland has no right to exist. It doesn't mean the movement for Irish independence was illegitimate or is illegitimate. That would just be much too narrow an approach. And I think one of the things we'll see as we explore this point of view is that we live in a time when the word Zionism and Zionist are often misused, sometimes even deliberately misconstrued, sometimes even in anti-Semitic ways. It seems to me that the role of the word Zionism and Zionist is not so different these days from the treatment of the words feminism and feminist, which are words that are sometimes dragged through the mud unfairly and painted in very dark, sometimes sexist ways. And that's not right. Of course, feminism is the belief that women are equal human beings and deserve to be treated as such. And of course, there are different kinds of feminism, and there should be. That's how debate works. And Zionism, right, is the belief that the Jewish people is a people, which we are, and that we as a people have the right to self-determination, which we do. This is, of course, something that all peoples have the right to, the Jewish people no more or less than anybody else. Self-determination as a principle, the idea that every people deserves to be free and masters of its own fate, particularly comes to the forefront after World War I. Woodrow Wilson is a big proponent of it. And in the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that was originally ratified in 1966, the very first article is, all peoples have the right of self-determination. And that's what we'll see Zionism putting forward in modern Jewish history. I think we'll see together that each of the different forms of Zionism plays its unique, valuable role in putting a piece of the mosaic in of what modern Israel is, and indeed what modern Jewry is. And I think it's helpful for us to have the chance, it's not easy to be a minority. It's not easy for us to patch into our heritage, ancient and modern alike. And it's not easy to tune out all the distractions of the world. And there are many distractions, particularly in these difficult times, sometimes very important work that can be sometimes very vexing in these difficult times. And so in these difficult times, I think it's important to come home to the sources of what Zionism was founded to do so that we can have a deeper awareness, deeper understanding of it, to help us truly appreciate what is special about our modern Jewish homeland and our modern Jewish world, really across the world, and perhaps to have a sense for our current difficult moment, particularly our very difficult moment for our beloved modern Jewish homeland now, after October 7th, to have a sense of how Zionism can guide us through our hardships now, and despite it all, what there is to celebrate in our modern Jewish homeland, how Zionism can guide us in our fight, but also what we're fighting for, what we can celebrate that no one can take from us about the true wonder that our modern Jewish homeland is. So on that note, I will bring up our sources for today. And by the way, if you prefer, in the top right, there is the button for view options. You can choose side-by-side mode, and you can make the text smaller or the faces bigger, should you wish. And if you have questions, please hang on to your question, because at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion. If you feel the desire, by all means, write it down. I don't want anyone to forget, because discussion matters, and everybody's voices around the table, the digital table in this case, that matters enormously. And I'm so excited for us all to have the chance to explore these sources together. So on that note, I invite us all to join in our bracha for the study of Torah in all its forms. That will include our more religious sources that we'll explore later, but even the secular sources are explorations of Jewish history and how we live out our values, and what we sense from beyond any one of us alone is expected of us, what we have to do to take care of ourselves, and how we live those out in action. And in ancient as in modern Jewish history, our tradition upholds the conviction that on some level, according to what that means for each of us, that perspective on Jewish history is sacred. So I invite us all in this spirit to join in our bracha for the study of Torah in all its forms. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. All right, forms of Zionism. Let's start with political Zionism, the form and the figure that started it all. Theodor Herzl, the great journalist and convener of the first 6 Zionist congresses, and known in Israel as Chozeh HaMedinah, the envisioner of the state. Theodor Herzl is a journalist in Vienna, minding his own business in the late 19th century, when all of a sudden his world is shattered by the Dreyfus Affair, by the Jewish French soldier Alfred Dreyfus being put on trial for treason. Of course, the only thing he did wrong was being Jewish. He did nothing to sell out the French to the Germans. It was completely an anti-Semitic lie. And Herzl witnessed mobs in the street shouting death to the Jews. And not only as a budding Jewish leader, he was in fact originally quite assimilated, but it lit a spark in him as a budding Jewish leader and frankly as a journalist. This is someone who could spot a trend when he saw one. And he sensed a whole lot. When he saw that mob shouting death to the Jews, he knew this was not going to be over in a day or even a year. And here's what he writes in his landmark pamphlet in German, Der Judenstaat, the Jews' state. The idea which I have developed in this pamphlet is a very old one. It is the restoration of the Jewish state. Now, by the way, I'll note at the outset, this is the Jews' state, Jews as people. So this is never, and this is consistent throughout Zionism, it's never a theocratic project. You know, it's never that halakha, Jewish law, should actually govern every single citizen of the state by force, regardless of their beliefs. At no point is that on the table. It's Jewish state, the way the movement for a free Ireland proposed an Irish state, the way the principalities of Italy unified into an Italian state, the way some propose a Tibetan state, or indeed the way some now propose a Palestinian state. It's a Jewish state where the Jewish people can be free. So that's an important term, I think, from the get-go, another term that is sometimes misconstrued in these difficult times. Why a Jewish state? Here's what Herzl writes. We are a people, one people. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. And for the sake of time, I'll skip ahead. This is one of, to me, the most poignant sentences in Jewish history. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers, and often by those whose ancestors were not yet domiciled in the land, where Jews had already had experience of suffering. To me, this sentence sums up what anti-Semitism is and what the Jewish experience in Europe has been. And incidentally, I shared this once with a close friend of mine who's Black, and he said that he felt that this very much also evoked and described his experience as a Black man in America. And sure enough, Herzl writes, not that he's simply describing reality. He's not saying it should be this way, but this is the way it is. The majority may decide which are the strangers. If we could only be left in peace, but I think we shall not be left in peace, for old prejudices against us still lie deep in the hearts of the people. And then Herzl, again, as a journalist as well as a Jewish leader, has this incredibly poignant catalog of all the different forms of anti-Semitism, large and small, right? In Russia, fees are levied on Jewish villages. In Romania, a few persons are put to death. In Germany, they get a good beating occasionally. In Paris, the Jews are shut out of the so-called best social circles and excluded from clubs. Everything tends, in fact, to one and the same conclusion, which is clearly enunciated in that classic Berlin phrase, Juden raus, out with the Jews. Now, this is in 1896 that Herzl is writing this. The Dreyfus Affair begins in 1894. So in 2 years, Herzl has figured the whole thing out. And of course, we know from our vantage point in history that just a few decades later, the phrase Juden raus, the German for out with the Jews, will take unspeakable new levels of horrors. So here's what Herzl says. I shall now put the question in the briefest possible form. Are we to get out now, and where to? And here's what he says. The whole plan is in its essence perfectly simple. Let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. The creation of a new state is neither ridiculous nor impossible. We have in our day witnessed the process, right? Poland got free and then was later conquered by the Austro-Hungarians on one side, the Russians and the Germans all around, right? Countries are created, countries go under, right? There's no reason we as Jews can't take matters into our own hands and make this happen so that we have a political country where we as a people can be safe, where no one's going to give us a good beating, where no one's going to kill us, and indeed where no one's going to exclude us from social circles and exclude us from clubs. Dignity, as well as life and death, matters, right? This is a place where Jews can be alive, and this is a place where Jews can live a full life, the kind of life that really lets your heart be free and not be trampled by anyone with derogatory glances just because of who you are. And Herzl goes on to outline his whole plan for the politics and the business and the farming and all the different practical ways this is going to happen. And then, of course, there's the question of where this is going to be. Should the powers, the international powers of the time, declare themselves willing to admit our sovereignty over a neutral piece of land, then the society will enter into negotiations for the possession of this land. Here, two territories come under consideration: Palestine and Argentine. Yes, you heard that right. Argentine. In both countries, important experiments in colonization have been made. And he goes on to talk about what the options are. At one point in his leadership of the Zionist Congresses, even Uganda is considered, because he goes to the British and they say, well, we've recently been taking over whole parts of East Africa. Maybe we could offer one to you. Now, of course, that makes sense in no way, right? First of all, that isn't fair to the East Africans who actually live there. No one asked them. Secondly, we as a people aren't from East Africa, right? We're not indigenous to East Africa. That would make no sense. And how would you rally people around a plan that was so implausible and so bound to lead to failure, right? So it doesn't work out in the end. But the point is, Herzl's a political Zionist par excellence. It doesn't actually matter to him if it's Palestine, that is to say, the land of Israel, which, by the way, just for reference, at this point in history, Palestine is actually a Jewish-flavored name. Obviously, contemporary Palestinian nationalism is a different story that develops over the generations as the Arabs who live in the land of Israel respond to Jews coming to the land. And then you have the 60s and 70s and Yasser Arafat and the PLO and all manner of things. That would be a different topic for a different day. But at this point in history, Palestine is actually a Jewish-flavored name. The coinage of the name goes back to the Roman Empire giving this name to the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, after they put down the Jewish revolt of the 130s. They derived the name from the Philistines, and they chose that name based on our ancient enemies as a way to taunt us. But at this point in history, Palestine is a Jewish-flavored name. The Ottoman Empire is ruling the territory with different districts: the District of Jerusalem, the District of Damascus, all sorts of districts. But Palestine is a Jewish-flavored name. And Herzl's thinking is it doesn't matter if it's Palestine, Argentina, or Uganda. And actually, he supports the language of the state being German. But as long as the Jews have a country where they're safe, that's what matters. Now, we see a very different perspective that really is in dialogue. Again, a machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute for the sake of heaven, in the view of Achad Ha'am, right? Herzl, political Zionism par excellence. But Achad Ha'am, one of the people, the pen name of Asher Ginsburg, he develops cultural Zionism. And here's what he writes. Judaism is going to return to its historic center, the land of Israel. But what are we going to do there? Are we going to consider Argentina and Uganda? Are we going to be German speakers? No, we're not. We've had enough of that. We're going to contribute to the common stock of humanity, in the future as in the past, a great national culture, the fruit of the unhampered activity of a people living by the light of its own spirit. And the truth is, you don't need an independent state yet to do it. What do you need? A good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of civilization, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature. This Jewish settlement, which will be a gradual growth, will become in the course of time the center of the nation. By the way, recognizing that the diaspora will always be there too, but Israel can be a center of world Jewry in dialogue with the diaspora. What kind of center? Wherein its spirit will find pure expression and develop in all its aspects to the highest degree of perfection of which it is capable. Then from this center, the spirit of Judaism will radiate to the great circumference, to all the communities of the diaspora, to inspire them with new life and to preserve the overall unity of our people. And eventually this will lead to a state, right? To establish a state there, but one which will not merely be a state of Jews, but a really Jewish state. That's what he lays out. That's what he lays out. He says, Herzl I'm not disagreeing with the things you're saying we should have, but I want to point out everything you're missing. It wouldn't be enough for us just to be Jewish bodies safely walking around on steady earth. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need the whole richness of Jewish literature. We need to be able to practice science. We have to revive the Hebrew language. Achad Ha'am is a big proponent of that. We're not going to be speaking German. I don't have a problem with German Jews speaking German or Viennese Jews like you, Herzl, speaking German. But we're not going to speak German in the land of Israel. We're going to revive the Hebrew language as the vernacular, just like our ancestors spoke. We're going to write new poems like King David writing the Psalms. It's going to be glorious. That's what we're going to do. And that's how you have a truly Jewish state in terms of the national life of the nation. And I think that both of these views put enormous pieces on the mosaic of the riches that we are grateful to enjoy now as current day Jews. Herzl lays the founding groundwork. You can't have what we're describing as a Jewish homeland without a political unit that's free on land with a government and all the rest. But I don't think we would feel right if we got off the plane at Ben Gurion Airport and everyone was speaking German and we looked around and we realized it was actually Argentina or Uganda. It's the whole richness of a Jewish national culture, the incredible Israeli songwriting that we study together, the incredible poetry, the Weizmann Institute of Science, the Technion, where incredible research is done in Hebrew, in the language of that Maimonides, as a great rabbi and doctor of the Middle Ages. There's even a hospital named for Maimonides in Haifa, right? To think that now there's a Jewish country where there's a hospital named for Maimonides. Now that's a Jewish state in the wholehearted cultural sense of the term. For fans of Rodgers and Hammerstein, two nice Jewish boys, I think of the line in South Pacific when the GIs say to Emile de Becque, the Frenchman, "You have to join us in the war because we're against Japan." And he says, "I know what you're against, but what are you for?" And I think Herzl is the figure par excellence of what we're against. Anti-Semitism, attacks, and that's true. But Achad Ha'am lays out what we're for, a cultural center that can inspire and nourish all of world Jewry. And that's really true. If you think about someone like Leonard Cohen going to play for the troops in Israel during the Yom Kippur War and coming back to North America to write songs like Hallelujah. If you think about wearing Jewish star necklaces, all these things that we in some ways take for granted now, Israel is the spiritual center that Achad Ha'am visioned that can inspire us all. So that's Herzl, founder of political Zionism, and Achad Ha'am, founder of cultural Zionism. So let's all take a deep breath, sort of a fusion of meditation and study, and absorb these ideas into our hearts. 1, 2, 3. Feels good, doesn't it? Okay. So, by the way, a favorite case study of mine in the role of Jewish arts and culture in building the modern Jewish national home is that, in fact, the current figures on the Israeli shekel bill are early modern Hebrew poets. I love that. I mean, can you imagine if our dollar bills in America had Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Langston Hughes, and Robert Frost? Well, that's the idea. And so here we have Rachel. She was just known as Rachel. Her full name was Rachel Bluestein Sela. Here she is. And here's Shaul Chernichovsky, the poetry we want, the mustache we need. Here's Leah Goldberg. And here is Natan Alterman. There are some iconic photos of him smoking a cigarette, but they didn't choose that one for the bill, probably wise. And you'll see they actually have little excerpts of their poetry on the inverse side. You wouldn't have this without Achad Ha'am. With Herzl, you wouldn't have any of this. Frankly, it'd all be written in German in the first place. This is the fruits of Achad Ha'am's contribution to Zionism, and something that we all get to enjoy as diaspora Jews as well. So moving ahead to the Zionism of action. A lot of Zionism was written in words, but when Zionism took place on the ground, especially in the formative generations, it was primarily about action. And this was best evoked, I think, by Yosef Trumpeldor of Geduda Avodah, the labor battalion, who was also a leader of the 650-strong Zion Mule Corps of the British Army in World War I. there was a feeling by some Zionist leaders that if World War I is going to end with Palestine in Britain's hands, and we're going to ask for a Jewish national home, then we should do our share to make that victory possible, so we aren't just asking for a favor in some sort of way. Trumpeldor was a leader of this movement, and here's how he envisioned his call to action for Zionism. We need people ready to serve at any cost, whatever task Palestine requires. The metal, whatever is needed to forge anything, whatever the national machine will require. Is there a wheel lacking? I am that wheel. Nails, screws, a block, take me. Must the land be dug? I will dig it. Is there shooting to be done? Are soldiers needed? I will enlist. Policemen, doctors, lawyers, teachers, water carriers. If you please, I am ready to do it all. I am not a person. I am the pure embodiment of service, prepared for everything. I have no ties. I know only one command: build. And this is how the modern Jewish state was built, by people like him who were willing to drain the swamps of malaria, to take the stones out of the soil to farm it, to put up all these towns for Jews to immigrate and live in. There was even a movement called Choma Umigdal, wall and tower, where overnight, literally, people would put up a wall and a tower and say, now there's a town here. And particularly in times of British restrictions on building, if you did it overnight, you could say, well, look, now there's a town here. What do you mean we built a new town? It's already here. It's morning and it's here. And if you're curious to learn more about that movement, I invite you to ask our beloved neighbors in our Jewish neighborhood, Nadav and Ziva Raveh. Nadav's father was a figure who was part of building a Choma Umigdal kibbutz, putting up the foundations overnight. And it's a legacy that Nadav and Ziva are deeply proud of, as they richly deserve to be. Now, I think right out of the gate in early Zionism, we see that every movement in the human condition, short of a future messianic era, according to what that means to each of us, is fraught with certain Achilles heels. That there's no one answer that is completely unproblematic, except we would say God is infinite perfection, according to what that means for each of us, right? God is infinite glory. God is infinite justice, but no one human idea is. Every idea has a partial truth, and we put them all into the mosaic together. So I think we see right out of the gate in early Zionism a certain danger in the idea of I am not a person. There's a collectivist impulse here. The kibbutzim were highly collectivist and socialist. In the early kibbutzim, the children even lived separate from their parents in a children's dormitory. This was particularly ultimately dismantled after the Gulf War because people's hearts were breaking to not be together as families when Saddam's Scud missiles were falling. You know, at the end of the day, you can't restrain the human heart. Love, family, yes, we are each a person. You can't restrain that. But this generation was willing to restrain that. You could argue it has a certain danger, but you could also argue that's how we built a country. It wasn't going to happen any other way. We should be grateful to them. And the truth is, I think existentially, those are just both true. There's a certain danger in this idea that Israel had to correct for as the generations went on. But the truth is, the country wasn't going to get built any other way. And I do think we owe a debt of gratitude to the Israeli pioneers, as we do in America, to the generation that endured the Depression and World War II, who I think had kind of a similar ethos. As the great Zionist pioneer Humphrey Bogart says in Casablanca, the problems of two people don't mean a hill of beans in this crazy world. And I think that's how the Zionism of action approached the situation. So let's take another deep breath. And let's move ahead to diaspora Zionism. Where do we fit into all this? Now, if you go back to late 1800s, early 1900s, France and Germany and Britain, and even America, let's be honest, in terms of the history of bigotry in America, the truth is there was enormous, enormous backbreaking pressure on Jews not to look disloyal. There was an idea of, we're going to break down the ghetto walls. We're going to let you be a citizen. But if you're going to be a good Frenchman, you got to prove you're not really a Jew. Jews, you have your own thing. You can't be both, right? You're disloyal. You're secretly some other conniving, sly, wily little thing, aren't you? Or are you going to prove to me that you're a good Frenchman? and you just go into one building one day a week to worship in the Hebrew persuasion or the Mosaic persuasion, we don't ask you what you do in there, just like Protestants and Catholics don't ask each other, but are you a good Frenchman in the street or not? The social pressure was excruciating. And who came along to help us liberate ourselves from this relentless pressure not to have an identity as a people? None other than the great lawyer and future Supreme Court Justice, the very first Jewish justice, Louis Brandeis. And here's what he said in a speech to a conference of Reform rabbis. The Reform movement was originally against Zionism, partially because of human universalism, which is to be admired and is a Jewish value, but can't that go hand in hand with the fact that we're a people and all peoples are equals? Well, of course, if you're under excruciating anti-Semitic pressure, that's very hard to do. So here's what he said. Let us bear clearly in mind what Zionism is. It aims to enable the Jews to exercise the same right now exercised by practically every other people in the world, to live at their option either in the land of their fathers or in some other country, a right which members of small nations as well as of large, which Irish, Greek, Bulgarian, Serbian, or Belgian, may now exercise as fully as Germans or English, right? If you don't have a problem with an Irish person or a Greek person having love for Ireland or Greece and wanting to move there if they choose, what do you have a problem with Zionism for? Why all of a sudden when Jews have a love of our homeland that's disloyal, but you can be an Irish American or a Greek American? Now, of course, there was also a lot of bigotry against Irish Americans and Catholicism. And so what Brandeis is articulating is that equality for Jews as a minority in America and our love of our homeland goes hand in hand with the same rights for all people. And that's part of American diversity, right? He was a figure articulating this. It was radical then, and frankly, it's radical now. It's a vision I think we all have to fight for each other, whether you're Korean American or Indian American or indeed Jewish American. We all have our identities and our homelands, and that's to be not only respected, but celebrated. And here's how he puts it. This is an incredible paragraph in American history as well as Jewish history. Let no American imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with patriotism. Multiple loyalties, right? That was the allegation. Multiple loyalties are objectionable only if they are inconsistent. A man is a better citizen of the United States for being also a loyal citizen of his state and of his city, for being loyal to his family and his profession or trade, for being loyal to his college or his lodge. Every Irish American who contributed toward advancing home rule was a better man, I would say, now that it's long after 1915, I'd say a better person, and a better American for the sacrifice they made. Every American Jew who aids in advancing the Jewish settlement in Palestine, though he feels that neither he nor his descendants will ever live there, will likewise be a better person and a better American for doing so. This is extremely significant. It lays the foundation, like Achad Ha'am culturally, it lays the foundation for our relationship as diaspora Jewry with Israel, that we can offer love and support not living in Israel as part of dialogue with our beloved modern Jewish homeland. And we can also have this position in dialogue with fellow Americans, right? I mean, President Biden has a deep love for Ireland. He's visited his family's hometown in Ireland, and that's great. And maybe one day, I would have said Joe Lieberman some number of years ago, I guess Senator Sanders is probably past the moment, but we'll have our first Jewish president one day. And why shouldn't they love Israel as much as President Biden loves Ireland, or as much as President Kennedy loved Ireland? Why shouldn't they, right? That's good for America, not only Jews or Irish. It enriches the fabric of diversity in America. It enriches the equality of America, and that matters. So let's turn briefly to religious Zionism. It's similar in some ways to cultural Zionism with Achad Ha'am, but it takes it to the next level in certain ways. Rav Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of British Palestine, he has this very interesting perspective where he sees Israel as part of something much greater. Here's what he writes. Redemption is continuous. The redemption from Egypt and the final redemption are part of the same process of the mighty hand and outstretched arm, which began in Egypt and it's evident in all of history. Moses and Elijah belong to the same redemptive act. One represents its beginning and the other its culmination. This is the tradition that Elijah the prophet one day will come back to be the harbinger that the Messiah has come to announce the infinitely perfected world. And of course, that's why we open the door for Elijah at the Seder. We're hoping every year this is the year. Is the world perfect yet? Last time I checked, not yet, but we're still working on it. We're not going to get there unless we work on it, right? Tikkun olam, repair of the world, so that together they fulfill its purpose. The spirit of Israel is attuned to the hum of the redemptive process, to the sound waves of its labors, which will end only with the coming of the days of the Messiah. I love that. We're attuned to the hum of the redemptive process. And he sees the reestablishment of a Jewish country as part of this arc toward redemption, according to what that means for each of us. The arc toward perfected human history, toward perfecting the world. He sees modern Israel as part of that arc. Now, again, right, we see in each idea we're exploring here the riches and the Achilles heels. One of the things that Rav Kook lays out is this interesting idea of that you know, the early Zionists were all secularist, and there were lots of hardline religious figures who explicitly said Zionism was heretical. Until the Messiah comes in flesh and blood to lead us, there shouldn't be a Jewish country. Right? Rav Kook broke with that hardline position. That's good, but he did it in an interesting way. He said, but Jewish secular nationalism is a form of self-delusion. The spirit of Israel is so closely linked to the spirit of God that a Jewish nationalist, no matter how secularist his intention may be, must, despite himself, affirm the divine. There's something a little nasty about this idea. I know what you think, but despite yourself, you actually think what I think. You don't know it, but I know it. There's something, Rav Kook, I'm glad he was in dialogue with secular Zionists, but there's something potentially a little dangerous about this idea, I think. There's something potentially a little bit troubling, right? They, secular nationalists, will then realize that nationalism or religion or any other element of the spirit of Israel can realize itself only in the context of a Jewish life that is full, stirring, and entirely true to every shade of its essence. Now, that's true. I think we'd all agree. This is why you need Herzl and Achad Ha'am. You need the political and the cultural united in a holistic experience of being Jewish. But this idea that I know what you think better than you know it yourself, I know the work you're doing is part of the arc that I see that you don't see, there's something a little dangerous there, right? Our return to Zion will succeed only if it will be marked along with its spiritual glory by a physical return, right? Strong and well-formed bodies and a fiery spirit encased in powerful muscles, right? The holiness of the land. The idea that we believe that there's a religious calling to claim the physical holiness of the land, and secular Zionists are supporting us. They don't think they are, but they are. There's something potentially a bit hardline and dangerous in this idea. And so again, I think we're seeing the seeds of what's beautiful in Zionism, and also certain ideas where we may want to say, you know what? I want to point out an Achilles heel where I see one. Let's celebrate the riches, but let's be careful and cautious, right? So I think it's important to note that the idea that the land itself is holy and that there's a religious call to settle it, and that then that there isn't room for negotiation and there isn't room for moderation from a secular point of view, because even the secular people really support us. They don't know they do, but they do. That's potentially an idea that can be taken to extremes, and we have to watch that. No idea should be taken to extremes, right? That always will lead us down a dark alley. So let's take one more deep breath. And I want to turn to one more thing together before ultimately I open the floor for questions and Q&A. And by the way, for folks who have to depart with a hard stop at 1, by all means, folks should do so. It's 12:45 at the moment. But for folks who have time to stick around, I'm more than happy to stick around a little bit and take a few more questions. And of course, the conversation is always to be continued. So here we go. Different perspectives and divisions within political Zionism, labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism. And to fill in some of this political dispute, I think it helps to look at a little bit of what's happening in history right now, right? The British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour declares the classic Balfour Declaration in 1917, just at the end of World War I. Not yet at the end, but they're preparing. The Allies are getting ready. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Okay, so we got something very interesting here. The Jewish national home is going to be supported by Britain, who's going to be the last one standing in the land of Palestine when the Ottomans fall. But what we see here is not the Jewish state. It's not an independent country. It could be. It's a national home for the Jewish people. So, of course, Britain being the imperial power it sets up its own imperial rule, the British Mandate for Palestine, and allows Jews to immigrate under its overall exercise of power. And the idea is that this is going to happen alongside equal rights for all. And Jews in other countries don't get their citizenship stripped just because now you can go back to Palestine if you want to. We don't believe in that sort of thing. So Britain makes all that clear, right? Here is the land that the League of Nations assigns to British authority. We got Palestine here and Transjordan here. All of this is originally Palestine. The League of Nations actually assigns all of this to Britain. Syria is French up here. Egypt is already an independent country. Saudi Arabia, and on we go. So Britain actually makes the decision to split Palestine on the west bank of the Jordan River, not the West Bank yet in the modern sense. We'll get to that in a second. But this whole joint is former Ottoman land that the League of Nations assigns to Britain. And Britain decides that the League of Nations mandate for Palestine actually assigns that the Jewish national home will have Jewish immigration, right? And by the way, that goes on to be a key cornerstone tenet of Zionism, the law of return, that any Jew can immigrate to British Palestine and later Israel under the law of return. The same way that, my mom actually tried to apply for Polish citizenship because my grandfather was born there, right? Ireland, Greece, a lot of countries have laws that if your family's from there, you can apply for citizenship. So the law of return, ultimately in Israel, as well as under British rule, the idea is every Jew, because of our unique diaspora history for millennia, is treated as if we have our very own grandparents who are from there, right? So we got Jewish immigration in the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, and the ability for Jews to move there and to live on the land. These are important. But the League of Nations gives Britain the right, if they want to sever the east bank of the Jordan River and not have any Jewish immigration there, not have Jews moving there to live. And that's an interesting decision. Britain goes ahead and uses that power. They sever it, and this leads to a split. Labor Zionism, which is also highly socialist and tied to labor unions, hence the term labor Zionism, works with the British. They collaborate with the British, having not a Jewish state right away, but a Jewish agency. That's what it's called, the Jewish Agency. First headed by Chaim Weizmann, and then, of course, David Ben-Gurion, who goes on to be the first prime minister. And they work with the British, and they accept the British's terms. And labor Zionism, in a very big picture sense, it's not an exact comparison, of course, you might say is like Martin Luther King in terms of collaboration and moderation. But here's who the Malcolm X was. The Malcolm X, the more hardline, radical militant figure, was Ze'ev Jabotinsky. He breaks away to start revisionist Zionism, which he calls because he wants Britain to revise the mandate and the policies to include, once again, the east bank of the Jordan, Transjordan, as part of where there's going to be Jewish immigration and where Jews are going to be living. This is where we first see the dispute between moderation and compromise territorially versus the position that the whole land of Israel, originally including what's today the country of Jordan, should be part of a Jewish state. And Jabotinsky also wants a Jewish state immediately. He doesn't think we should be collaborating with Britain. He wants an independent Jewish state with its own military now. Now, we might ask, Why was this important to him and those who followed him? Well, part of it is that the whole land of Israel, particularly so ultimately after the 48 war, and this will be beyond what we have time to get into today, but after the UN partition plan in 1947 and the Israeli War of Independence, what stays in Jordan's hands is first of all the country of Jordan, which Britain has given them here, and they keep what they're calling the West Bank of the Jordan River, which is this area, right? So the modern dispute over whether Israel should make compromises in its land or whether it should hold to the position of the whole land of Israel, the part of the sense is that the West Bank is actually really the heartland of ancient Israel and its history. King David's hometown of Bethlehem, King David's first capital, Hebron, before building a capital in Jerusalem, many of the hometowns of the prophets, they're all in the West Bank, right? So there's a lot of love of Jewish history, right? And I think even in advocating compromise, if one does, there's a certain heartbreak in trading away that land. You would only do it for the sake of peace, right? Or equality. But for Jabotinsky in the 20s and 30s, there's one more small but incredibly crucial piece. The 6 million were still alive. Jabotinsky wanted European Jewry to be able to move to both banks of the Jordan River. And what he used to say was, give us a state on both banks of the Jordan River. And in a few years, we'll have 8 million Jews and 2 million Arabs living in complete peace and equality. If there's a Jewish prime minister, there should always be an Arab vice prime minister, and vice versa. Jabotinsky contemplated an Arab prime minister. He was completely committed to equality and equal civil rights. What he wanted was an instant independent Jewish state without the British interfering, so that the 6 million could be rescued. He knew it was going to happen. One of my favorite pieces of Jewish rhetoric, which we won't have the time to read all of for the sake of today, but I just want to look at this briefly. Here's Jabotinsky, serious looking guy, as befits such a militant leader. He writes, Achad Ha'am and culture, Rav Kook and religion, all that, of course, is most important. But as compared with our actual needs and our real position in the world today, all that has rather the character of luxury. Why? Because, he says, what can be the concessions? We have got to save, this is the late 1930s, speaking to the British government. We have got to save millions, many millions. I do not know whether it is a question of rehousing 1/3 of the Jewish race, that is nation, half of the Jewish race, or a quarter of the Jewish race. I do not know, but it is a question of millions. And of course, what ultimately happened was it was 1/3 of the Jewish people who perished in the Shoah. Jabotinsky saw it coming, and that's why he wanted both banks of the Jordan River was as a place for us all to live, and there'd be a big enough Jewish majority for equal rights for the whole Arab minority. Now, some today say, well, the faithful thing, if you follow Jabotinsky's view, is we should still insist on the whole land of Israel, not the kingdom of Jordan anymore. That would be a very radical position. We have peace with Jordan. But we should keep the whole West Bank. That's what Jabotinsky wanted. That's where Jewish history has its heartland. That's where we should be now. But there are also liberal Jabotinskyites who say, look, Jabotinsky was arguing that in a time when there would have been equal rights with an Arab minority because the 6 million was all going to come live there and we'd have a huge Jewish majority. Now, it's heartbreaking, but the 6 million perished. It's heartbreaking. It's also part of reality. So the liberal Jabotinsky position goes, if Jabotinsky were alive today, he would say the Zionist thing is to make sure we can have a Jewish majority country with equal rights for all. And that means giving up the overwhelming majority of the West Bank because there's over 2.5 million Palestinians who live there. That's what we have to do now. And sure enough, in the 2015 Israeli election, the left-wing opposition to Netanyahu called the name of their ticket the Zionist camp, Hamachaneh HaTzioni. They said, what do you mean we're anti-Zionist? We're the Zionists here. We want to preserve a Jewish majority country with equal rights. And the number 2 person on the ticket had formerly been Likud. She'd formerly been right-wing, Tzipi Livni. Her parents worked with Jabotinsky, but she felt if he were alive today, this is the position he would call for. Territorial compromise so we can have a Jewish majority country with equal rights for all. And this is the debate that we see in these sources. These are the different ideas that we see. And so if we think about everything that we love about the modern Jewish homeland and what it is to have world Jewry today, when we think about having a political safe haven, an independent country that defends itself, and there are debates about how to do it and when to do it, but those are important debates to have. And not just the politics, but the culture, the incredible Israeli songwriting that we have the chance to listen to and study today, and the way it inspires North American Jews like Leonard Cohen to do the same, and the way that we as diaspora Jews like Louis Brandeis have the chance to be a part of it all. This is the story of how all that came to be. And it's my prayer that it's something we can savor and that can guide us in our moment now. So in that spirit, I'd like to open the floor for questions. And in particular, if there's someone who has a hard stop at 1, I want to make sure you ask your questions now. Otherwise, I'm happy to stay on the call for some amount of time. We had a question in the chat about the original labor Zionist leader who Ben-Gurion followed at the head of the Jewish agency. His name was Chaim Weizmann, it's a German style Weizmann, as the leader of the Jewish agency. And then he was the first ceremonial president of Israel after independence. So I'm curious, again, particularly if someone has a hard stop at 1, if there's someone who has a question or a comment that they feel inspired to share. No pressure in the least. No one's being cold called. It's not a law school class. Larry, take it away. Larry has a question.
Okay. A couple of questions. Just number one, it's a little bit off topic because we're all talking about equality and freedom and all that in many of these texts, and that we have a place to express ourselves. Were the early adopters, if you will, like Herzl and Brandeis, were they contemplating equality for women in the state? Number one. And number two, how much of the early text dealt with the sort of the old argument of it can't be, we can't go back until the Messiah comes. How did they deal with that issue, specifically Herzl?
That is a very profound pair of questions that I so appreciate. In terms of the role of equality of women in early Zionism, a really full-fledged answer, you'd probably want to read a history of early Zionism. There are historians and specialists who'd be able to answer that better than I could, but I can recommend a couple.
All right.
I recommend by Daniel Gordis, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. And I also recommend Benny Morris, Righteous Victims, A History of the Zionist Arab Conflict. Those are two good ones to start with. And Yossi Klein Halevi's Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor is a bit more personal and cultural in the Echad Ha'am spirit. I certainly think, at least relative to other countries and societies at that time, that Zionist society was much more egalitarian. Women as well as men played roles in founding kibbutzim, in serving on their committees, in digging up the soil to get rid of the boulders to farm. Women and men were drafted right away into the IDF from the beginning. Golda Meir was the first Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union, I believe right out of the gate in 1948. And then, of course, prime minister. And America still hasn't had a female head of state. So that's one answer. As for the question about, tell you what, I'm going to come to that in a second, Larry, about the return to Zion from a religious perspective. But I want to loop in a question that Vivian writes in the chat. She writes, from the Palestinian perspective, this sounds like colonialism. How to respond? Vivian, I'm glad you said that. It's important to have dialogue. It's important to listen to each other. And even if we don't agree with what our neighbors in the land of Israel might be saying, we have to listen as a matter of respect for our neighbors because they're created in the image of God too. this is a particular place where Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is very powerful. And the new editions have a series of responses by Palestinians, letters and responses at the back. But here's the big picture. Let me try to sum it up for you like this. I remember when I was in high school, we had one of these 8 o'clock stay late panel discussions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And all the kids trundle into the gym. Oh no, here we go again. And the first speaker says, here we are in the school gym. And he points to the scoreboard and says, here's the problem. This scoreboard says home and guest, but both of these peoples in the conflict think of themselves as the home and the other as the guest. Is that a powerful statement? Well, it's powerful enough to stay with me 20 years later. So I guess so. And I think the answer would be that at the end of the day, I'll put it to you this way. I didn't intend on telling all these high school stories. In all other classes, I do not mention my high school even once. Why in this class twice? I can ask that at the Seder this year.
About the
But
same
my
way.
high school history teacher, I'll say her name to honor her, a woman named Carly Wade, an incredible, incredible human being to whom I am infinitely grateful for educating me. She says at the beginning of class when we're studying the creation of Israel, why was the state of Israel created? And one kid says, because of the Holocaust, the Jews needed a safe haven. And she says, that's one reason, but there's a reason the Jewish state wasn't created in South Carolina. And it's true, right? We are not the Belgians in the Congo. We are not the British in India. We never were. We are indigenous to the land of Israel. Again, not in a theocratic sense. Although, as I said, in Rav Kook's ideas, you see some elements that, if taken to extremes, can go in disturbing directions. And I think all communities have to be on guard against extremism, right? But it's not theocratic. It's the history of the Jewish people indigenously, like the Irish in Ireland, like the Tibetans in Tibet, right? Who we lived out our national culture. We created the literary riches of the Tanakh, of the full Hebrew Bible, and of the Torah, whether you believe in it religiously, not, both, or neither, right? That we are indigenous to this land. It's the land that we're from. Hebrew is a Semitic language. We have so many cognates with Arabic, which always is an incredible joy to see, such as the famous Shalom Aleichem and Salam Aleikum. Um, and this is the land we're from. There's only ever been one land that we're from. As individuals, we're from lots of places, right? I grew up in the Boston area. I'm American. But as a people, we're from the land of Israel. We didn't just randomly go to a place like Congo or India to take stuff, put people down, and not care what happened. We came home. We came home. And not only that, but as a persecuted people that wasn't going to make it anywhere else. But again, there's a reason that our country didn't get set up in South Carolina, or for that matter, Uganda, or Argentina, or some piece of Britain after the war as reparations. And what I would say is that from the point of view of Palestinians who also feel that they're the home, and that we're the guest as Jewish immigrants coming in the 1920s and 30s when they are living in the land. Again, there isn't a Palestine as an Arab nation, right? At this point in history, right? It's Arabs living in the overall Arab world. There's districts of Jerusalem and Damascus and all sorts of things under Ottoman rule, right? So it's not as if there was one country and we replaced it with some other country. At no point did that ever happen, right? Jews start to move to the land, particularly starting in the 1880s, but really taking off in the 20s and 30s. And of course, by the way, when Jabotinsky pleads with Britain to let us all in, that's precisely when they shut the gates to Jewish immigration, because there are riots in the Arab communities, and the British don't want to bother dealing with a hard problem, right? Okay, but so we're immigrating, we're coming, and the Arabs who live there are responding to the fact that we're starting to immigrate to this land, and eventually we're going to become a majority, and in 48 start a country where they're going to be a minority. And the War of 48, of course, there's displacement of Jews in the Arab world and of Arabs in what's going to be the state of Israel, which is a whole different conversation and class. And Palestinian nationalism develops in response to that. And in some ways, not so different from the Boston Tea Party developing and American nationalism responding because they didn't want to live under the British anymore. So from the point of view of the Palestinians who say, we're at home here in our land, I think we should listen. I think we should respect that that's deep in their hearts. And we don't have to give up our narrative either. We can love our narrative and listen to their narrative. And that's different from colonialism. It's different from the Belgians in the Congo. It isn't simple. It's very complicated. And I think we can hold all these pieces at once in another machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute for the sake of heaven. I hope that answers your question. Are there other questions? Are there Vivian adds in the chat, there were Jews there before the birth of Jesus. There sure were, like Jesus's parents, Joseph and Mary. Mary, of course, in the original Hebrew being Miriam, without a doubt, right? King David goes back 3,000 years to 1000 BCE. Absolutely. Curious if there are other questions. No pressure.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Take it away, Howard.
So, in light of October 7th,
yes,
where is this equality? I mean, I don't like Netanyahu, and I'll say that, but I mean, the Jews have a right to exist there, and they have to be able to eviscerate this anti-Semitism that's in their locale. And I guess my problem is I'm conflicted by what I see as all the death versus what I believe is necessary for the state of Israel to exist. And that is to eviscerate Hamas and stop their teachings, which are so ugly. And as the recent developments that show that the UN is an antagonistic organization which has been screwing Israel for years and years and years. That's it. It's not really a question. I feel so deeply I'm so hostile to this notion of Hamas to eviscerate Israel. I mean, we have a right to exist there.
That's a very powerful statement. And I appreciate all the different facets to the cube, so to speak, that you just put on the table. I think that that's really a message for our time. And this is why it's my prayer that going back to these traditional sources in a very chaotic moment can perhaps restore our sense of centeredness in the guidance as a compass that Zionism can offer us. So let's take Jabotinsky, for example, as arguably the leading militant early leader of the state. He published a classic essay called The Iron Wall in the 1920s. And what he wrote is that Zionism is just. We have the right to come back to our land, to have an independent country, and have, as all peoples do. And, we were persecuted. We need a safe haven, but also the land of Israel is our indigenous land. And Jabotinsky writes, the Arabs who live in the land of Israel are not going to accept this quietly. And what Jabotinsky writes is, I'm saying that because I do respect the dignity of the Arabs. Anyone with dignity would not want a place where they're in the majority to become a place where they're in the minority. From their perspective, they have the right to that. Jabotinsky said, I'm the one who, as a militant, I'm the one who respects the Arabs. He said, it's the Zionist left who's racist because they say, well, if we just build enough railroads and we just drain the swamps of malaria enough, they're going to be so grateful to us that they're not going to wage a fight. Jabotinsky said, no, are you kidding? Nobody would sell out being a majority in their homeland for a few railroads and a few swamps drained of malaria. They're going to fight, and they have every right to fight, but we have every right to fight back because our cause is ultimately more just. Because the Jewish people had no country, and because we're indigenous to the land of Israel, and because we were offering and are offering equal rights for the Arab minority who would continue to live there, and because there already are independent Arab majority countries, Jabotinsky said our argument for a Jewish state versus the argument of those who will fight us is the argument of starvation versus the argument of appetite, right? They're both arguments. They both have legitimacy, but ours is more just. We're going to have to fight. We're going to have an iron wall. That's why he called the essay that, an iron wall of self-defense that shows that we're here to stay, that shows that we're here for good. But, and this is what hardliners and extremists leave out when they quote Jabotinsky, but once the Arabs see that we're here to stay, then they will make peace with us. And then we will finally be able to live in peace with our neighbors. And that will be the conclusion of the journey of Zionism toward an independent, free, and safe Jewish state. And of course, that's what happened under Jabotinsky's protege, Menachem Begin, as the leader of the Likud party, making peace with Egypt. Sure, he was a right-winger. He also wanted to make peace, just like only Nixon could go to China. And he made peace with Egypt. And that's lasted to this day. So Howard, part of what I take your question to be pointing to is, what do we do with an enemy like Hamas that's not like Egypt? That is to say, Egypt had a president, Anwar Sadat, who was a responsible person, who didn't want his own people to die for nothing in endless war, who wanted to make peace, who saw it was in the self-interest of Egypt, who didn't have a fanatical extremist theocratic obsession with killing Jews. And I'm not exaggerating. Hamas says in their charter, on the day will come when Jews have to hide behind stones and trees. And even the stones and trees will say, "O Muslim, O servant of God, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." So Sadat was a reasonable person. Sadat and Begin could sit down and negotiate toward a plan that would be in the self-interest of all. But what do you do when you're dealing with unhinged, theocratic, bigoted, anti-Semitic extremists? And again, this is not an exaggeration. This is a description of what Hamas is doing. And Howard, I think you're really putting your finger on something very deep, that we're dealing with a very different kind of enemy here. It was none other than the legendary Israeli peace activist Amos Oz, who advocated territorial compromise, a lion of the Zionist left as an essayist and a fiction writer. He advocated a two-state solution. He advocated an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank. But Amos Oz said, when it comes to Hamas, you can't compromise with an enemy that believes your country has no right to exist. You can't compromise and say, okay, we'll agree to exist only on Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. So I think you're really putting your finger on something, Howard, that we have to fight Hamas and stop them from doing things like October 7th, murdering over 1,200 Israelis simply because they're Israeli, and then going on to say, Hamas goes on and says this, we're going to work for October 8th and October 10th and October the millionth. We have to fight and stop Hamas while also taking into account the fact that every human being is created in the image of God. And we have to minimize Palestinians being caught in the crossfire, innocent Palestinian civilians being caught in the crossfire. And when we see the high death tolls in Gaza, that is heartbreaking. I will say for the record that numbers have shown that about a third of the deaths in Gaza have been Hamas militants. That's actually a very good ratio. When Bill Clinton led the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999, actually only a quarter of deaths were militants. So we're doing better than Bill Clinton and NATO. That's pretty good. It should still break our hearts because we should be sensitive, but we also have to be able to defend ourselves. And it's precisely this balancing act. That's why Hillel says in Pirkei Avot, Chapters of the Ancestors, both, if I'm not for myself, who will be, but if I'm not for others, what am I? Either one by itself would be an oversimplification. It's the fact that he said both that makes the difference. And I think there's also a dialectic tension, not only between our own self-defense and the lives of others, but also between short-term and long-term. How do we fight Hamas while keeping in mind some possibility of a long-term strategy and diplomatic future that won't be like this forever? And even if we're not sure what it looks like, we have to think that way at least a little bit. If we don't think that way at all, a different long-term future and a big picture strategy to get there will never happen. If we at least think that way a little bit, we can try to chart a course to a future that's different. Surely in the wars of 48, 67, and 73, no one could have imagined that we'd have peace with Egypt. But it's thanks to statesmen of both the left and the right Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin on the left and Menachem Begin on the right, that we did ultimately have peace with Egypt. And it was none other than Yitzhak Rabin who said, we must fight terrorism as if there is no peace and fight for peace as if there is no terrorism. So this is, I hope, the guidance that Zionism can provide us with today. Are there other questions?
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Other questions at the moment?
I just have a real quick question, Rabbi.
Please, take it away.
I was trying to explain this once to a person about Zionism, and I guess the part that confused me was how fast was it changed, or how fast did they actually consider Uganda or Argentina? Because that does give kind of like a colonial feel to it. And did they actually settle on Palestine because that's where the history is? So was it just kind of thrown out there early and then just, and then they said, no, we really need to focus on Palestine?
Ellie, that is an excellent question. And as you say, it's in dialogue, Vivian, with your question about how to respond to the charge that Zionism is colonialism. I affirmatively declare Zionism is not colonialism because we're not like the Belgians in the Congo and we're not like the British in India. We didn't randomly go to the land of strangers where we had no business going and no history just to take things and oppress people. At no point did that ever happen. Now, is Zionism complex? Yes, it's complex. Can Palestinians have their narrative that they bring to the table? Yes, they can. But whatever we're talking about here, we're not talking about the British in India, and we're not talking about the Belgians in the Congo. We're talking about something else. And I think that you're wise, Ellie, to raise the question of Argentina and Uganda. Those never got serious traction. Herzl bandied them about, and Britain raised them in its typical clueless imperial fashion. What a disaster it would have been to try to set up a Jewish state in Uganda. As my father likes to say, the British have the world record for getting up from the table before the check comes. And of course, we see that as well in the bloodshed of 48 in Israel's War of Independence, which was poorly set up by British diplomacy that came from not truly being sensitive to solving the hard problems involved. Ellie, I think you're right. If we'd picked Argentina or Uganda, then you could have said, sure, it's an oppressed people who need a safe haven, but why are you making us pay the price for European anti-Semitism? Why are you putting it on our backs, right? And by that logic, and there are some who say this, by that logic, maybe as reparations, you create a Jewish state out of the former territory of Germany, and they're the ones who pay for it. And there are some who say this sort of thing, but exactly as you say, Ellie, the point at the end of the day, and this caught traction really early and throughout the Zionist movement, is that it had to be in the land of Israel. It's the only land that as a people we're really from. Uganda and Argentina were floated by Herzl. But when you look at Achad Ha'am and the sense of the Jewish people returning to its center, that was really always the vision that really had traction from the beginning and onward.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Other
the key word is indigenous, and that is the essence of what you're getting at.
Exactly. Exactly. We are a prior indigenous people who returned to the land in the form of our descendants. And there were other folks, Arabs, who were living there at the time, who claimed the land as home as well. And these are just all true facts that we have to acknowledge, as opposed to saying any one rules out the other, right? The idea that if it's our indigenous homeland, well, then there were no Arabs there, or Arabs have no right to a narrative of their own, that would not be true. But the idea that Arabs were there, so therefore Zionism is some sort of hoax and some sort of racist oppression, that's not true either. We have to be able to hold all the pieces of the mosaic in place at once. That's how we're going to have greater understanding.
So I have one last thing, and I'm taking too much of your time, but the problem is I've never seen such rampant anti-Semitism in my entire life since October 7th. It's like the Netanyahu just doesn't realize what he's doing is creating this terrible new organism that never, at least hasn't existed in the 20th century, since the 1900s. I mean, the 1800s. I mean, I grew up in the middle of the 20th century, and I don't know about you when you went to law school, but when I went to college and law school, the fact that I was in a Jewish fraternity and the fact that I was Jew was an afterthought. No one hated me because of that. But look what's going on with kids in school today. It's crazy, and I don't know what we can do about it as Americans. I haven't figured that out.
It's a great question. Before I give an answer, is there anyone else who has a last question before we wrap up in a few minutes from now? No pressure in the least. But if anyone else has a last question, I can do a round robin and include them all.
Could you just tell us, answer how we will get, those of us who have said in the chat about wanting the references and the handouts, how will we get that from you?
Oh, I can share that by email, and this recording will go up on YouTube with the other Lunch and Learn sessions, so that this can be viewed later in the future, which is part of, I mean, as my dad would say, that's why God created YouTube. It's an incredible blessing to be able to return to these sessions again and again. And if you're joining on YouTube, hi, so glad you're here with us. Carolyn, do you have a question, please? Carolyn, you're muted.
Hello?
Hello,
Hi.
take it away, Carolyn.
Rabbi, all I wanted to do, because I can't wait to hear your answer to the question on the table, I just wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for your powerful, clear, insightful, educational presentation. This was amazing and wonderful, and I thank you.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. I'm so moved to hear you say it. That is so kind of you. I deeply appreciate it. So here's what I'll say. Howard, I take your point very much. And to be clear, I take your point to be, obviously Netanyahu is not in fact creating anti-Semitism, right? There's no such thing as a Jew creating anti-Semitism or a gay person creating homophobia, right? It's always, or a woman creating sexism. It's always done by bigots in response to us as bigots' own idea. I take your point to be that perhaps, in your opinion, Netanyahu is not being sufficiently prudent in his course of action so as to navigate the stormy currents of these times. And so I think, again, we can return to the sources of Zionism for guidance, so that when Herzl in the late 1890s says, da, 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 where are you, Theodore? Where are you, Teddy? Here you are, Teddy, looking over the bridge in Basel at the 6th Zionist Congress. What a visionary of the state you are, right? Old prejudices against us still lie deep in the hearts of the people. This kind of thing is always in the human condition. It's never gone unless we make it gone in every day that we live. And I do think we're seeing a lot of people choosing to draw on prejudices out of the human condition, as well as in history, of all the anti-Semitic canards of which history is breathtakingly full. And I think it's very disturbing, especially for our kids in high school and college. And I see that with our confirmation kids who have to deal with people saying on social media, Israel bombed such and such a building, when it's not true. And Rabbi Miller and I say to them, well, you have the right to know when something's not true. Just as it would be untrue to say Trump won the 2020 election, it's untrue to say Israel bombed the hospital. It's sometimes things are not true. And we deserve to know that. We deserve to know that. Now, sometimes someone isn't open to dialogue. We do live in a very hardline time when increasing numbers of people say, if you don't agree with me right off the bat, then I'm not even going to listen to you. And that's very dangerous, because then how can we ever come together and have dialogue and learn and grow and solve problems? But for those who are open to dialogue, I think when we know on our inside what we think and what we know, when we have our sense of facts as well as the narrative that we bring to the table, and Palestinians can bring their narrative to the table, and then we talk about it together, right? As long as we have on the inside what we know, what can make us feel confident and strong and heartened, and what we want to bring to the table, then the question is there someone on the other side of the table to talk to in dialogue? Sometimes there isn't, and sometimes there is. And sometimes there isn't, but perhaps someone, if we get to know, sometimes getting to know someone better, their mind can open. Sometimes it doesn't. But if we always stay ready to share what is true in our defense, but also ready to share perhaps in a more sensitive way for those with whom we're on the same page, or where there's a possibility of being on the same page because we're on the same page in terms of the importance of dialogue in the first place, then I think that there's potential that we need to hold on to there. And all of these things can strengthen us because we know what we can bring to the table. And we just hope there's someone who's willing to come to the table to talk to us on the other side. And this gets back to what Brandeis said, what Justice Brandeis said, that it's a terrible thing to say that somehow, Jews aren't loyal Americans, or, if you're a Jew, how can you be president of the student body at UCLA because you're not going to be loyal, or this sort of thing, which is rearing its head now again, right? Just the way you can be an Irish American or a Greek American, or in more recent times, a Korean American or an Indian American, you can be a Jewish American. And we know that we have the right to stand on that truth in equality with Americans of all backgrounds. We know that. That can strengthen us. That can hearten us. And for those who are willing to have dialogue, well, that's beautiful. And for those who aren't, at least we know on the inside that we're doing all we can, and that can strengthen us. I want to share one concluding note, which is this morning, as I was driving to the temple, I was listening to one of my favorite Israeli songs, and it seemed to me that what I was listening to really summed up everything that we've talked about today. It's by the great Israeli singer-songwriter Meir Ariel, a very literary figure in the Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell style. And the song is called "We Got Through Pharaoh, We'll Get Through This Too." And every verse, he talks about difficulties in his life, and then he ends, "But we got through Pharaoh, we'll get through this too. Aval avalnu et paro, na'avol gam et zeh." And it seems to me you couldn't have the nourishing Jewish richness of something like that without everything we've talked about today, without an independent political country, one that can defend itself. Folks will debate how much and when, and that's an important debate, but without the cultural and the spiritual richness of Hebrew poetry and songwriting and a shared Jewish majority society that gets the references, that then can share those out to the diaspora and inspire all of us, and inspire songwriters like Leonard Cohen, and inspire all of us who listen as the modern Jewish people. And what a great blessing it is that no one can take away from us, right? As the great modern Hebrew poet George Gershwin wrote, "They can't take that away from me." No one can take that away from us. And what a great blessing it is to celebrate that together in love. So on that note, Sohoraim Tovim, good afternoon, an expression we also wouldn't have without modern Hebrew and Zionism, and my love and my spirit are with you all.
Have a good day.
You too. You too.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Oh,
Thank
absolutely.
you, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's
Love how you
wonderful.
integrate music.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind.
It's amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you all. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.